In this video, we're going to go over one of the biggest debates in nutrition, and that is carbs, and more specifically, the glycemic index and what this means for you. Hey there, I'm Dr. Anna. I'm a medical doctor. I was trained in Italy, and on this channel, you're gonna learn how to master your health with the Mediterranean diet. So let's dive in. We're gonna start with the basics. To fuel itself, our body needs to extract glucose from foods. Now, foods are complex in the way that they are, but generally, we like to classify these into three main categories. And these are our macronutrients, and they are sources of fat, carbohydrate, and protein. Now, truthfully, energy can be extracted from all three of these types of macronutrients, but carbs give us the most direct source of energy for our bodies compared to protein or fat. And carbs do this by giving us a source of glucose. Fats and proteins happen to have a little bit more complex chemistry going on when it comes to getting energy from them. So in reality, it is just much easier to use carbohydrates as energy for our bodies overall. Usually, we refer to foods as being either a carb, a fat, or a protein. In other words, foods falling into one of their macronutrient categories. But that's not really how it works in reality. Make a note to yourself that most foods are kind of complex in their nature, and they probably have at least two, if not all three, of the macronutrients in them. We're going to return to this concept later. Now, why is it that carbs can be considered the best source of fuel for our body? Let's break this down in very simple terms. So they are the preferred source of fuel or energy for our body because ultimately everything's going to get broken down into a form of energy that our cells can use. And this cell energy is called ATP. Now, the chain of events is that carbohydrates become glucose and glucose becomes ATP. And then our cells use that ATP to do their metabolism and all of the chemistry that they need to do. So given this direct chain of events, glucose can be considered a very direct source of energy for our cells. And understanding the specific reasons why this is would require us to dig deep into biochemistry and learning all of the different metabolic pathways like glycolysis, the TCA or the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, gluconeogenesis, and so much more. And that is some nitty-gritty heavy science stuff. I don't believe any of that is necessary for you to know how you can be healthy. You can leave all that science stuff to us health professionals. Now, many of you watching right now may be wondering how keto plays into all of this. So you may have heard something about the keto diet or ketone bodies themselves. While we're not going to discuss ketogenesis in this video or ketone metabolism, understand that our body does have backup methods to get energy for our cells if glucose is not around, and ketone bodies are one of these backup sources of fuel. So let's get back to our carb story. When it comes to carbohydrate foods, not all are created equal. And here is where we finally introduce the idea of glycemic index, which is a way to classify carbohydrate foods based on their quality. Now, before describing what the glycemic index is, we need to understand how this framework came to be and how it got created. This will help us understand if the glycemic index is good or not good for us to use. So here's the deal. Because blood sugar is so important for our overall health, nutritionists and researchers have created a way for us to understand different foods and how they're going to impact our blood sugar. And this is called the glycemic impact. Now, nutrition advice used to be to think of foods only in terms of what molecules are inside of them. But it turns out this doesn't really give us the whole story, and I would argue is actually a somewhat misleading way to think about food and nutrition, especially carbohydrate metabolism. So one way this story was often told in the past, and is still told by some people, including some doctors, is by stating that, for example, two different foods that are completely different have the same amount of sugar in them, so they must be equal. A common example that you might hear is that a chocolate bar has the same amount of sugar as a cup of grapes. Now, this, in my opinion, is extremely problematic and confusing for people. It is misleading and can honestly be a dangerous way to understand nutrition and food science. So with newer research and a bit of a better understanding about how all of this stuff works, the idea became, instead of thinking of our foods in terms of simply the molecules that make them up, we need to think about foods in terms of how they are broken down in our body and how they are actually metabolized. And this is why the glycemic impact was created. So now that we understand the background story of the glycemic impact and its approach, let's break down what it is. But first, please subscribe, because if this video is useful for you, I'm sure there are other people out there who are also going to find it very useful. And the more subs we have, the more people can get access to these videos. So the glycemic impact is a scoring system for evaluating how foods affect our blood sugar. and it comes in two different varieties. The first is the glycemic index. It is an artificial number that looks at the ease to which our bodies can break down a food into simple glucose and increase our blood sugar. So a food with a high score is considered a high glycemic index food, and this means that it's broken down faster and more easily into sugar, and in turn will increase our blood sugar faster. This is versus a low glycemic index food, which in turn is going to be broken down more slowly and thus increase our blood sugar more slowly, or increase our blood sugar less overall. Now, the second variety of glycemic impact is the glycemic load. Now, the glycemic load takes into account the glycemic index of a food in the context of that actual food. So it's really looking at how easy it is for your body to break down a food into sugar, but it also considers how much sugar overall is in that food per the amount that you'd normally eat. So a perfect example of this is watermelon. Watermelon is a very high glycemic index food because it is simply broken down into sugar very easily in the digestive process. But in fact, watermelon, for the amount a person would normally eat in one sitting, is a very low glycemic load food, meaning for about a cup or 2 cups of watermelon, there's actually not that much sugar in it overall. So some foods can be high glycemic index and low glycemic load at the same time. And alternatively, we might have a food that has a low glycemic index, but a high glycemic load at the same time. These two really go hand in hand. So what's good about this system? Well, it puts blood sugar at the front and center of our focus on thinking about what foods we want to be eating. And we know this is extremely important for our metabolic health, and especially for folks who have diabetes. So it simply is targeting the direct element that is the most important when considering what to eat for somebody who might have some trouble with regulating their blood sugar. But there are some issues with this approach. The first issue is that glucose response and blood sugar is impacted by many more elements beyond just the glycemic index or the glycemic load of a food. Some of these factors include the quality of the food source, the quantity of the food source, the overall nutrient composition of that food and how caloric it is, the acid levels of our body, the processing and cooking method of that food, just to name a few. The second issue with this approach is that we eat real food, not molecules. So the artificial scores or numbers on individual foods is really skewing our perception of how a whole meal is impacting our blood sugar and our health. We almost always are eating multiple types of foods together. And this blends right into issue number 3, which is that we often eat whole meals, not individual foods. And meals are complex in their makeup. And of course, our blood sugar is impacted by many things beyond carbohydrates themselves. So if you've seen any of my other videos, you've probably heard me talk about something called the Healthy Trifecta. And what is the Healthy Trifecta? Well, quite simply, it's a framework for thinking about what a healthy and balanced meal should look like, or a healthy and balanced snack. And that is incorporating fiber, healthy fat, and protein are all together going to slow down the blood sugar spike after your meal. And we know that slowing down our blood sugar increase is really important for our metabolic health. Now, a fourth issue with the glycemic impact approach is the other side of the equation. And this is how insulin is responding. In other words, the insulin index. Now, when it comes to blood sugar chemistry, it's really all about how our body responds to blood sugar increasing. We do not want our blood sugar to be too high for too long. So what that looks like is that after we eat a meal, that food is getting broken down into sugar, and that sugar is getting shunted into our blood so it can go around to the cells of our body. But for our body to really be able to use that sugar for fuel, it needs to enter inside of our cells. And the way it can enter our cells is from a hormone called insulin. So we need insulin to be at the correct amounts at the correct time to make sure everything is coordinated and working according to plan. So many people argue that measuring the glycemic index of a food or a meal without also measuring the insulin index is pretty useless to get an overall picture of how our food is impacting our overall metabolism. And this article, which I'm going to link for you in the description below, summarizes this process pretty well. So you might be wondering, well, what is my take on all of this? I'm gonna be really frank. I dislike this system. I think in general, giving number scores to foods really overall overcomplicates the whole process of healthy eating. Eating is a primal experience and is something I'd argue needs to be experienced in our body, not just in our brains. We can get way too cerebral with thinking about healthy food and nutrition. And that's really important because overall, eating and spending time at meals should be an enjoyable process. But let's be clear, there is more than one way of framing a healthy diet and healthy eating and healthy carbohydrates. The glycemic index is just one of many. journey. Another framework for evaluating the quality of carbohydrate foods and how that impacts our health is the simple versus complex carbohydrate framework. And I talk about that in this video over here on pasta. But ask yourself right now, why are we even bothering with trying to understand glycemic index, the carbohydrate quality, or any carbohydrate framework? Well, in general, thinking about carbohydrates and carb-containing foods is going to change depending on our personal goals. Are we an athlete? Do we have diabetes? Are we trying to lose weight? Now, if health is your main goal, then I cannot recommend enough digging your heels into learning about one of the most evidence-based and delicious approaches to healthy eating and lifestyle. And that's the Mediterranean diet, which I break down in a really easy series for you to get started today. Jump into those videos if you're ready. But if weight loss is your goal, then I'd argue the best thing you can do is to really understand weight loss and its entire process at a much deeper level. And I have the perfect playlist for you over here where I break it down in really simple terms. Jump into those videos and I'll see you in there.